Hi everyone. This is an introductory course on the design of a radio frequency system. In this course, we will mainly look at the design of a wireless link at a system level. As I've discussed the handout with you guys in the previous lecture, mainly we will focus on the transceiver architectures and some important RF circuits like LNAs, oscillators, power amplifiers. And then we'll spend a substantial part of this course on the design of phase lock loops. But before we go into the technical details of this course, I'll very briefly take you through the history of the radio or wireless communications. How did we land up here from the times when we communicated using smoke and talking drums? So mainly, this story is a story that spans nearly 200 years. So I'll very briefly take you through the salient inventions which led to the wireless revolution of today. So first we'll start with what is wireless communications. Now as humans, and in fact like most animals, are social in nature, their communication is something that always existed between animals. It can be oral, it can be visual, and for example, a lion wagging its tail is an indication, it's a warning sign, and that you have to stay away from it. A dog wagging its tail, it has a very different meaning. So we have always, as animals, we have always communicated with each other. But it's only in the last 150 years, around mid 1800s onwards, where technology had catapulted us into a new age of communications. It's not just human to human communication that's forming a lot of traffic today. It's also the devices which we invented. The device to device communication forms a significant part of the data traffic today. The future that we are going to live in is a future of a human to machine, and a machine to machine communicating world, where it's a pervasively connected world that we will be living in the future. But where did all of this begin? So we will look at the earlier forms of communication, then the history of electricity, magnetism, and then eventually electromagnetism, and how these two merged and created or dawned us, or rather took us to a new age of wireless communications. So to tell this story of which spans nearly 200 years, I will dramatize a few events, as I've already said that, only keeping the essence of the story intact or the history intact. Our story begins in the year 1954. Around a span of few months, two great minds ended their lives tragically. Now, as we see at a much later stage the history, we will understand why did these two great minds, which contributed greatly to the human progress, had ended their lives. But first, I'll also quote a very interesting quote, which is by the French philosopher JeanPaul Sartre. He said, "Hell is other people," and it greatly applies to the lives of these two men. They contributed greatly to the society, but the circumstances that they were in drove them to tragically end their lives. Now, before we begin this history, I'll quote a very interesting quote by George Bernard Shaw about the English playwright George Bernard Shaw, about the unreasonable man. A reasonable man adapts himself to the world around him. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Progress, therefore, depends on the unreasonable man. Now, again, before we start into the history, I'll discuss the Holy Trinity of wireless communications. As we discuss the technical details of this course, as we go about discussing about how to design a radio frequency system or a wireless system, there are three fundamental questions that we'll have to answer. How far, how fast, and how reliably. How far can you communicate? How fast can you communicate? And how reliably can one communicate? Or can communication take place between two devices or two humans? So, just to give a heads up, how far can communication take place is generally determined by the transmit power, the power you're transmitting, and the receive sensitivity, how well the receiver can receive, and also the channel conditions, the medium in which this information is being transmitted. The next is how fast. Now, that is determined by many constraints, but one of the major ones being the bandwidth of the channel. The third one is how reliably is the accuracy of transmission. In analog systems, is given by the signal to noise ratio. In digital systems, it because the information is binary there. Bit error rate is a more commonly used specification. Again, that how reliably is determined by noise of the receiver and maybe even transmit noise. Now, before we go into the details, I just want to talk about this Holy Trinity of wireless communications, because all throughout this course, we will only be answering these three questions by using different terms for them, but they will all be answering at an abstract level. They will be answering just these three simple questions: how far, how fast, and how reliably. Now, having said this, I'll start with this history of wireless communications. Now, the wireless communications, as I said, we have already communicated. So we'll look at some earlier forms of communication, and then we will look at the development of science and how these two fields merged. So first, the earliest forms of communication, one is the obvious one, which is shouting. The louder you shout, the farther your information will reach. And of course, how well the other person receives depends upon if the individual is hearing purely based on his hearing abilities. So of course, the how far the message can reach is determined by the person who's transmitting, how loud his voice is, and the person who's hearing, how sensitive his ears are. But this is one of the earliest forms of communication. The other older forms of communication, but I just don't want to call it drum as a technology, is the talking drums of Africa, where the tribes would convey messages over long distances by making different sounds of these talking drums. Then the American Indians would use smoke signals for communicating for longer distances. Smoke and fire was also used for communicating over long distances. But this was something, the communication used to happen at a very primitive scales for many years. But then we have to look at the development of or the evolution of science, then the marriage of these two fields. So for that, very briefly, I'll take you through the revolution that was sweeping across Europe in the most of the past millennium. So, but first we'll start with the Dark Ages. So this was a time in 1300s to 1400s was a time when, again, I'm focusing on the Western, the Western evolution of science, because that is more well documented and also fits well with the story, not to injure anyone's sentiments. So we'll start with the Dark Ages. It's around 13 to 1400s. That's when the scientists of that time were tried as heretics. And the natural phenomenon that they were observing were attributed as acts of God. Thunder famously was seen as the wrath of the gods, and they were popularized as mythical characters. Scientists who would reason and perform experiments were seen as sorcerers. One of these famous examples of the Dark Ages or the end of the Dark Ages is the execution or the burning of the mystic or the philosopher Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno, at the time, the popularly held belief was that Earth was at the center of the universe, but he believed in a heliocentric world. And he'd never changed his opinions even when the church came down on him. And eventually he was burnt at stake by an angry mob because he believed in the heliocentric theory. Now then came the age of Enlightenment, where reason was starting to take over blind beliefs. Now, in the dawn of this new age, one of the most popular characters is the man who created a new world, And in fact, if I recall from my memory, it's on the epitaph on the tomb of Newton, it's written, "Mortals rejoice, for here lived a jewel among mortals." So his ideas completely, the ideas of Newton, completely revolutionized the way the world operates. He mathematized what was seen as acts of God. In fact, Halley, after in early 1700s, proved Newton's theory by predicting the exact time and space at which the Halley's comet would arrive. So therefore, the cosmos is not operating by the command of the gods, but rather by equations that a man or human can predict. So this was one definitive proof of science completely taking over, the commonly held beliefs. The comets were no longer seen as bad omens sent by the higher powers, but it was something that a heavenly body obeyed certain rules, and it would again obeying certain rules precisely predicted by theories which humans can reason and create. Now, this is an interesting quote that I saw from a movie on the musician Ludwig van Beethoven, where the musician is known for creating some of the greatest masterpieces in the Western classical music. And towards the end of his life, he was slowly losing his hearing abilities, and he was not able to hear his own music that he created. And I'm not sure if he said it in his real life, but I saw this in a movie on Beethoven, and it said he actually storms into a church and shouts at the guard, saying that, "I forsake thee, Lord." Now here was a man who thought that he could say something like that in those days in front of the guard, because he believed his act of creating music gave him power to say something in front of the God who created the world around him. I'm just trying to tell you the changing mindsets. Probably, had he said that few hundreds of years ago, he would have been tried for hearsay and or for disobeying the gods. But I'm just trying to show the change in mindset over time. Now, this is where our story actually begins. So this is the point we are looking at now, the history of electricity and magnetism, which eventually was combined together by a great mind, and that was the birth of wireless communications. Now, this new force of nature, that was actually piquing the interests of magicians, was a force which, unlike gravity, could both repel and attract. So shown here is a famous trick where a boy is hung by wires, and he is charged by this rod here. Now once the boy is charged, the small gold leaf present on this plate will be attracted to the boy, and this gold leaf would fly and be drawn towards the boy's body and hands. Now this was seen almost as this was in fact performed as magic tricks, and so they didn't have an understanding of what this new force was. Now again, this is a famous experiment shown to the Queen Elizabeth during the Victorian era, and here is Gilbert. We will visit this man again when we look at the theory of magnetism, where he's performing this experiment where he's lifting a feather to a charged rod, a glass rod in his hand. Now, it took a lot of leaps of imagination in the late 1700s by several experimentalists, Benjamin Franklin included being one of them, to see that the electricity is in thunder is same as the electricity that one would produce in a lab. And they saw this new force that's actually present, the new force which could both attract and repel, is also responsible for the thunders in the sky. And in fact, there are some interesting stories that you can read up about of how many scientists tried to trap the charge present in the thunder, and many of them actually experienced a huge shock after they came into contact with the charge that they stored from the thunder. So again, this I'm just giving you a very brief history of electricity itself. So there were two famous theories of electricity proposed around this time. One was by Galvani, who believed that electricity was the life-giving force in animals. And what he did was he used to hang a frog and connect two metal rods to the nerve endings of a frog, the limbs of a frog. And what he did is that when he formed a connection, he would suddenly notice the legs of a frog, a dead frog, twitch. Now, what he proposed was that now electricity is something that's flowing in this animal. He called it the animal electricity. And the moment he connected a wire, he created a path for the current. So the source of the current or the electricity was the animal itself, and then the wire created a path for it. So therefore, current, or electricity was flowing from the animal through the wires. But then there was another opposing theory by Volta. What he proposed was that the electricity was actually present in the metals. The charge was actually present in the metals. When he made this connection, when he completed a circuit, the charge was actually flowing from the metal through the body and back. And that is why the animal was twitching. Not because it had electricity of its own, but because charge was flowing through that from the metals. Now eventually Volta did not stop there. He understood what he was talking about, so he actually built one of the earliest forms of batteries, which was called the voltaic pile. So by now we understood what electricity was. Not fully, because this was a time when the electron was not discovered. We didn't understand the source or the origins of it, but at least a reasonable understanding of it, and we understood how to store them. So after the invention of voltaic pile, there were two very interesting experiments which I'd like to discuss because I thought it makes for a good story. One of them is the experiments by Aldini, and he was a cousin of he is the cousin of the guy who actually invented the Galvani, who actually proposed the animal electricity. And what he did was he used to perform these experiments using this voltaic pile, and he would pass currents through the dead bodies and demonstrate that these dead bodies can be awoken. Now this would completely shock the viewers, because here it was seen as though through this new force of electricity that you could actually wake the dead, you could actually resurrect the dead. And this is again a very famous painting of his, which shows that here is a man who is actually able to seize the dead from the hands of the devil himself. So it was almost seen as an act of resurrection, but again, he couldn't bring them back to life. It was just the human bodies would just twitch vigorously. Now this inspired a young writer by the name Mary Shelley to create a character. This was one of the oldest science fiction stories, called Frankenstein. Is a Dr. Frankenstein who creates a monster which would eventually destroy him. And it's a story which had lived for more than a century, and it's being told and retold in many forms today. Then the other experiment is the experiment performed by one of the greatest British experimentalists in the early 1800s, where what he did was he constructed one of the largest voltaic piles, one of the largest batteries, and he brought two carbon rods together and demonstrated an electric arc to a stunned audience. So here he could create a thunder inside a lab, inside a room. So finally, electricity, which was seen as an act of God, thunders, which were seen as act of God, was fully understood, and they could even create it inside the lab itself. So he could hear, by the ideas that they could propose on earth, what man had finally done is to seize the God's thunder itself. Now, what I've discussed so far is the invention of electricity. By then we had the bell jars experiments, which predicted how to predict the force between charges, and the electricity was now well understood. Now I'll briefly take you through the mathematical ideas which were slowly shaping up in the early 1800s. Now before I start that, I'll very briefly discuss an interesting quote by the English playwright George Bernard Shaw. When Albert Einstein had visited, probably for a felicitation ceremony in England, George Bernard Shaw famously said that there are two kinds of men. There are men who create empires, and this creation of empires is with a stain of blood. And I wish such men were never born. And then when he was describing Einstein, he said, then there are men who create universes without the stain of blood. And it is these men that take humans to greater heights than what we have been before. So here is a man, the conqueror of the worlds, is Napoleon. In his court was a scientist or mathematician by the name Fourier, who again this was the time the Anglo-French were trying to colonize the world, so they would go in all directions. So the French would go down south in Egypt. At that time, Fourier also accompanied Napoleon, and at that time in Egypt he was working on the problem of conduction of heat in solids. At that time, to solve a differential equation, he proposed a very interesting solution that any periodic signal can be represented as a sum of sinusoids. And the frequencies of the sinusoids are multiples of each other. And this idea, Fourier series, would eventually go on to become the foundation for communication and signaling 100 years later. Around the same time, there was also the prince of mathematics, who was called Frederick in Germany. He was developing other ideas of mathematics. So there was the vector calculus was also being developed. So there was Navier-Stokes, their theorems, which would all be put to good use in a few decades to come. And this is a very interesting quote by other mathematician who was also in the court of Napoleon, called Laplace. And Laplace, the transforms that we use very often today, he made a very interesting, he had written the theory of the world or the universe without mentioning God. And he believed in a deterministic world, that you can predict everything precisely with science. And when Napoleon asked him, you have not mentioned God, since you have written on this theory of the universe, there is no mentioning of God in this work, and without mentioning the author of the universe, who is God. And he said, I didn't have to make that hypothesis. Now again, this is just to tell you the shift in the mindsets. Science has by now evolved to a point where a scientist could make a comment like this. Probably a few hundred years ago, he would not have been able to. Now around the same time, magnetism was developed as an individual, as a different field on its own. So we knew that there are some specific material or elements which had the tendency to attract ion filings and other metals. Now this had different origins than electricity. Electricity at that time, after building voltaic pile and all of that, was seen as a fluid flowing in a pipe. That's how electricity was seen as a fluid, as a mysterious fluid that flows in a pipe or flows in a wire. So magnetism had different origins. At that time, they didn't have an understanding of it, but that was also a field which was being slowly studied. Now, one of the great examples or applications of magnetism is the compass needle, which was popularly used by voyagers to determine the direction in the seas. Now, it was Gilbert, the English physicist, William Gilbert, whom we had seen a few moments ago, where he was demonstrating the experiment to the Queen of England. He had published his very interesting theories on magnetism, and he proposed that Earth itself is a giant magnet, and it explained why a compass needle works the way it does. And then we had the mathematics study of the magnetism, where they observed that a wire carrying current exhibits a magnetic field, and we can find the strength of the magnetic field using the Bayard and Servat had also proposed laws, and we can use certain equations to predict the strength of this magnetic field. Now here we had electricity developed fully. It had its own terms like permittivity and so on, and dependence on charges. And then we had theory of magnetism evolved, which had permeability, which was also independently developed. Now in around mid-1800s, a lot of experimentalists who were working on this electricity and magnetism made this interesting observation that a current passing in a wire was deflecting a compass at right angles. Why did this have an effect? So until then, they thought electricity is a fluid, so therefore any effect it has should be contained inside this wire. But why does this action at a distance happen? To understand this question was one of the greatest minds of early 1800s embarked on this journey. His name was Michael Faraday, who was actually the son of a blacksmith. He came from a very poor society, a very poor family. He was son of a blacksmith, and he was a bookbinder's apprentice. And what he did was he entered the lab of Humphrey Davy, where these experiments were being performed, and from there he proposed the theories by making these observations on the effect of current or passing in a wire on the magnetic compass needles. He proposed these famous theories of induction. I mean, how he thought of it is a slightly different story. I'm not going to the technical details of it. So that a changing current can induce an EMF in a coil which is physically separated from the main coil of interest. So he proposed his famous laws of induction. Until then, forces were seen as straight lines forces, but here is a man who proposed forces which can be circulating in nature. But since he came from a different society, he didn't have the mathematical basis or the mathematical strength to put his theory into mathematical form. For that, there was another great mind by the name James Clerk Maxwell, who worked on the ideas of Faraday and he gave a mathematical life to his ideas. And those equations were famously called the Maxwell's equations. Now, Maxwell made, of course, he used until then the theories of vector calculus and all of that to solve to this new theory of electromagnetism. And he observed that electricity and magnetism were linked. And when he was manipulating his equations, he found a very interesting result. He found that changing electric fields produce changing magnetic fields, and changing magnetic fields in return can produce changing electric fields. And what he could do was that he could see that this new electric and magnetic signals can traverse, or rather, what he observed was by manipulation, he obtained a one-dimensional wave equation. When you have a wave equation, a wave will also have a traveling speed, and that speed, which he calculated, turned out to be 1 by root of mu naught epsilon naught, which was exactly equal to the speed of light. And that's a brilliant result, because here was electricity with its own permittivity and other terms, and there was magnetism with permeability. And when he combined the two theories with the ideas of Michael Faraday, he suddenly got an expression of a wave equation, and the speed of the wave was exactly equal to the speed of the light. So that's the first time they saw that light itself was an electromagnetic wave, and electromagnetic waves can travel even in vacuum at the speed of light. That instant when he realized this, when he realized combined electricity and magnetism and saw that they can travel as a wave with the speed of light, was the birth of wireless communications. That's the fundamental idea, Maxwell's idea. Before that, Faraday had it conceptually, but he didn't have the mathematical gifts to translate into a mathematical theory. Maxwell gave that mathematical life to his ideas, and he formulated the theory of electromagnetism that's in use even today. And when Michael Faraday was performing his experiments, in fact, he performed his experiments on moving coils and changing magnetic fields. So he was demonstrating one of the earliest motors and alternators in the early 1800s. At that time, when they asked, what is the use of all these interesting experiments? And he said, what is the use of a newborn baby? And towards the end of this 1800s, the whole world is revolutionized. We had the Edison's electric bulb, electric trains, and so many things that would operate on the principles which Faraday was working on at the beginning of 1800s, or the beginning of the 19th century. Now the next question is, here we had a new theory, electricity, magnetism, and electromagnetism. Now the next question is, how can we use this new theory for communications? So to answer that, it's a very interesting mind which was working on this problem. There was a young and impoverished artist who lost his wife, and by the time he could reach his home, it was that by the time he received the message and reached his home, he couldn't be there for the final rites. So rejected at that time, he wanted to be an artist. Europe was a better place, so he was traveling from America to Europe. And on this voyage, uh, this artist's name was Samuel Morse. He was thinking about this problem of information transfer at a faster way. Can we transmit information or communicate faster? Now, by then, they knew one very important thing, that electricity traveled very fast. They knew that, and this is a very interesting experiment by a group of monks who connected themselves using a very long wire and to a voltaic pile. And when they closed the loop, they all of them felt an instant shock. So they knew by then that electricity can travel instantaneously. So now, can we use electricity for transmitting information? Then the job is to convert information to electricity. That was accomplished by Samuel Morse. He converted, because he saw the English language, and then converted it into a few messages called dots and dashes. And these dots and dashes were open and closed circuits and built using an electric circuit. So the task was now complete. This was the first time where technology was properly used for communications. So Samuel Morse invented what they called the electric or telegraphy. So this way of transmitting messages where each word was associated with a certain symbol. Here it was binary symbol, dots and dashes, which amounted to just open circuit or closed circuit. So every alphabet had a symbol, and they would just transmit these dots and dashes. And the receiver, there used to be the receiving end, there used to be dedicated workers who would decode this message and transmit it. Now, one of the earliest messages which was transmitted was "What hath God wrought?" Okay, this was one of the first telegraph lines. When they opened it, this was the message that they had transmitted. So telegraphy was one of the first inventions which married communications with technology. And telegraphy was also used by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War to get the Civil War updates. Now, if you see, as probably we'll see in a few moments and a few points throughout the story, at some moments, politicians have always made the best use of technology. Okay, so great political events have all had the best use of technology. So now the question is, how far can this information travel? Of course, we said we can use electricity to transmit information. The next question is how far? Since it is transmitted using a wire, how far will the wire take us? Now, since this telegraph line was in America, can this telegraph line be connected to across the ocean itself? Can this telegraphy line cut across the seas? So that was an imagination of mythical proportions. And this is just a scene to show from the Ten Commandments where Moses splits open the sea and people are led into it. And here, in a similar way, can information cut across the seas and reach the other end of the Atlantic? And that was made possible by the first transatlantic cable by a businessman named Cyrus Field, who, after many failed attempts, established the first stable transatlantic cable. In fact, the challenge at that time was to carry this huge amounts of wire on a ship and lay it out from one end to the other. If the wire snaps at any point, then you lose the wire to the bottom of the seas. So finally, after many trials, the way in which they succeeded was to carry half of the wire on one ship, half on the other ship, and at midway, when both the ships have traveled halfway through the sea, they were joined at the center. And this was one of the earliest forms of earliest transatlantic cables. Much more or better transatlantic cables would come in another 50 years when telephony becomes a reality. So now, we now knew by this end of almost towards the mid 1800s to the late 1800s, we had merged technology with communications, had now merged with technology. We could now convey information very fast and over long distances, but still using wires. Now, there was also some interesting theories. We needed some revision. So, for example, in telegraphy, when you transmit information over long distances, the conventional theories of electricity were also getting evolved. Kirchhoff's current and voltage laws, which were generally valid for static fields, was no longer valid. So at that time, there was other interesting physicist named Oliver Heaviside who proposed the telegraphers equations, which takes the spatial dependence also into account. So this was then used in the design of these new telegraph lines. We will very briefly see when we talk about S parameters and reflections at a later stage when we discuss this RF circuits, and we will see the origins come from this here on the theory of telegraph lines which the engineers were working in late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. So now the question is, what next? What is the next invention after this? We could now use electricity to transmit information, but can something be done beyond this? Do we really need to convert this information? Can we just directly talk? That next invention is telephone, and we'll look at it in the next lecture. Thank you.